A silent ride. The early morning light peered through the curtains of the Johnson family's home, painting the room in soft hues of amber. In the quiet of the house, 14-year-old Elijah Johnson was already up, his heart pounding with the excitement of the first day of school. His backpack, a black and red design with multiple compartments, rested by the door, packed and ready. Elijah's mind was filled with thoughts of his friends, his teachers, and what awaited him in the coming school year. But there was something else in his chest, an unshakable sense of unease, a feeling he couldn't quite place but knew had been with him for weeks. Elijah's father, Police Chief Marcus Johnson, had always taught him to stand tall, to hold his head high no matter the situation. But Elijah had a secret. As a young black boy, he sometimes feared the world outside his home. He feared the way people would look at him when he walked down the street, the way some would whisper when he entered a room. And every day, as the school year approached, the feeling of being judged intensified. He glanced at the clock. It was 7:10 a.m. "Elijah, you'd better hurry or you'll miss the bus," his mother, Lisa, called from the kitchen. "Coming, Mom," Elijah responded, grabbing his jacket and heading for the front door. His mom always made sure he had everything he needed, but this time he had a sense of dread that wouldn't leave him. The bus stop was only a block away from their home, so Elijah walked there every morning, listening to his music and trying to drown out the noise of his thoughts. As he stood at the corner, waiting for the familiar yellow bus to arrive, he noticed a few of the other kids laughing and talking. It was a typical morning, with a few of his friends already joking about summer break. Elijah tried to force a smile, but the unease lingered in his stomach. The bus finally arrived, its engine rumbling as it pulled up to the curb. Elijah made his way to the entrance, scanning the interior for an empty seat. As he boarded, the bus driver, Mr. Halverson, a burly man with a harsh look, gave him a quick, dismissive glance. Elijah felt a chill run down his spine, but he didn't want to make a scene. He simply nodded, hoping the ride would be uneventful. The driver grunted and waved him toward a seat near the back, a spot he had been avoiding for the last few days. Elijah knew that the back of the bus was often the place where trouble started, loud, chaotic, with no teacher to supervise. But it was also where the other kids tended to gather, and Elijah didn't want to be singled out as the boy who couldn't sit anywhere else. As he walked to the back of the bus, a couple of students turned to stare at him. Elijah tried not to notice, but the feeling of discomfort grew. He found an empty seat near the middle of the bus, sitting as far from the other students as possible. He could hear their whispers and giggles, but he didn't turn to look. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction. The bus doors slammed shut, and the vehicle lurched forward. As the wheels began to roll, Elijah stared out the window, watching the world go by. The morning air was crisp, and the trees outside swayed gently in the breeze. Yet despite the beauty of the world around him, Elijah's mind couldn't escape the unease that had settled into his chest. It wasn't just the whispers from his classmates. It was the way people seemed to look at him, like he didn't belong, like his presence was somehow an intrusion. Suddenly, Elijah's train of thought was interrupted by the bus driver's voice over the intercom. "Hey, Johnson, get to the back where you belong," Mr. Halverson barked. His voice was gruff, filled with an authority that seemed unearned. "This is not a fancy school, so stop acting like it is." Elijah's heart sank. His hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, he felt the heat of anger rising in his chest. He was used to being treated differently, to being looked down upon because of the color of his skin. But there was something about this moment that stung more than usual. Mr. Halverson wasn't just giving him a hard time. He was doing it in front of everyone, making sure that all the kids knew who was in charge. "Come on, man," Elijah muttered, his voice barely audible. He wasn't about to start a fight on the first day of school, but the insult was unmistakable. The bus driver, however, was in no mood to let Elijah off easy. "You're not special, Johnson," Mr. Halverson continued, his words dripping with disdain. "Get used to it. You're just another kid who needs to learn his place." Elijah's breath caught in his throat. The weight of Mr. Halverson's words felt like a slap in the face. He tried to ignore it, but the anger kept bubbling to the surface. What had he done to deserve this treatment? Why was he always the one singled out? The other students fell silent, sensing the tension in the air. Elijah could feel their eyes on him, some of them smirking, some whispering behind their hands. He couldn't help but wonder if they shared the same opinion as the bus driver, if they thought he was just another kid who needed to be put in his place. The bus came to a stop at the next intersection, and a few more students got on. Elijah kept his head down, focusing on the book in his lap, hoping the ride would end soon. He couldn't wait to get off this bus, to escape the scrutiny, the tension, the feeling that he wasn't welcome. But it wasn't just the kids who were watching him. The bus driver's words lingered in his ears, echoing in the silence. "Learn your place," he had said. Elijah closed his eyes, willing the anger to dissipate. His father, Police Chief Marcus Johnson, had always told him to rise above it, to take the high road, to never let anyone make him feel less than who he was. Elijah had always tried to follow that advice, to ignore the hurtful words, the stares, the judgments. But today, it felt like everything was crashing down on him. How much longer could he endure this treatment? How much longer before he snapped? As the bus turned down another street, Elijah felt his heart race. He couldn't wait to get to school, to be with his friends, and away from this. He just needed to get through the ride, to make it to school, to be someone else for a while. Little did he know that today, everything was about to change. The unexpected intervention. The remainder of the bus ride felt like an eternity. Elijah sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding the occasional glances from his classmates. His thoughts were racing, and the more he tried to block them out, the more they seemed to flood his mind. He replayed the words the bus driver had said, words that echoed in his head like a drumbeat. "Learn your place." It was a phrase that carried so much weight, a reminder of all the times he had been made to feel small, insignificant. He had heard these kinds of things before, whether it was from classmates, strangers, or even the occasional adult. His entire life had been a series of microaggressions and outright slights, each one reinforcing the feeling that the world saw him as less than. But he had always been able to brush it off, had always told himself to keep his head high and push forward. Today, however, was different. Today, something inside of him was beginning to crack. The bus slowly rolled down the street, its tires bumping over the pavement as it took the familiar route toward the school. Elijah was nearing the end of his ride, but his anxiety was nowhere near fading. The feeling of isolation, the sense of being watched, and the cruel remarks of the bus driver felt suffocating. He wanted to scream, but he stayed quiet, his fists clenched in his lap, fighting back the anger and frustration that were threatening to overwhelm him. As the bus stopped once again, Elijah's eyes darted up briefly, catching a glimpse of the other kids filing off the bus. One by one, they gathered their things, heading out into the world beyond the yellow doors. They walked with confidence, laughing, chatting, the sounds of their conversations fading as they left the bus. Elijah's stop was next. But before he could get up, the bus came to an abrupt halt, a forceful screech of the tires making everyone in the back of the bus flinch. Elijah raised his head in confusion. What was happening? The doors flew open with a loud bang, and Mr. Halverson stood up from his seat, his large figure blocking the doorway. Elijah could feel the tension in the air, the weight of his presence heavy and unyielding. "Johnson," the bus driver said, his voice sharper than ever, "you better get off now. Don't make me repeat myself." Elijah's heart dropped. He was just moments away from the end of his ride. Why was the driver making a scene now? Why couldn't he just let it be? A sense of dread surged through him as he stood up, grabbing his backpack. He tried to keep his head down, but as he passed the front of the bus, he felt Mr. Halverson's eyes follow him, burning into the back of his skull. But just as Elijah took a step toward the door, A voice rang out, loud, firm, and authoritative. "Hold up there, Halverson." It was a voice Elijah recognized instantly, one he would never forget. It was the voice of a man who had come to define the sense of justice in their city. It was the voice of his father, Police Chief Marcus Johnson. Elijah froze in his tracks. His heart skipped a beat. What was his father doing here? Why was he on the bus? He had never seen his dad drop him off at the bus stop or pick him up from school. The coincidence seemed too strange to believe. But there was no mistaking the commanding presence of his father as he stepped onto the bus, the doors still wide open in front of him. He was dressed in his police uniform, his posture tall and confident, with an unmistakable air of authority that made everyone on the bus sit up straighter. His dark eyes scanned the interior, immediately locking onto Mr. Halverson, who now appeared flustered by his sudden appearance. "What's going on here?" Chief Johnson asked, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable edge. "Why are you treating my son like that?" Mr. Halverson stammered, clearly caught off guard by the presence of the police chief. I was just..." "No," Chief Johnson cut him off. "You were being rude, disrespectful, and unprofessional. That's not how we conduct ourselves in this city, and it's certainly not how you treat a student." Elijah stood there, stunned, his eyes wide with disbelief. His father was here, right here. In this moment, he had intervened on his behalf, in front of the entire bus. Elijah felt a rush of emotions flood through him, relief, confusion, pride, and embarrassment all at once. It felt like everything he had been holding inside for years was finally being acknowledged, but at the same time, the feeling of being called out in front of his peers made him uncomfortable. Chief Johnson didn't give Mr. Halverson a chance to respond. He turned to Elijah, his gaze softening as he placed a hand on his shoulder. "Elijah," he said gently, "is everything okay?" Elijah, still in a state of shock, could barely find his voice. He nodded, unsure of what to say. He didn't know how to explain everything that had happened. The taunts, the insults, the feeling of being singled out. How could he even begin to explain how much it hurt? "I'm fine, Dad," Elijah finally managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know why he..." Chief Johnson squeezed his shoulder gently, interrupting him. "You don't have to explain, son. I'm here now. And we'll make sure this never happens again." He turned back to the bus driver, his eyes hardening. "You can't treat anyone like this, especially not a child. I expect a formal apology from you, and I'll be reporting this incident to the school board." Mr. Halverson was silent now, his face flushed with embarrassment. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, clearly trying to come up with something to say, but nothing came out. The weight of the situation hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Chief Johnson nodded once, as though signaling that the matter was settled. He placed one last hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Let's go, son. We'll talk more about this at home." Elijah followed his father off the bus, feeling the eyes of the other students on him, but this time the looks were different. There were no smirks or whispers. There was no laughter. Only silence as they watched the police chief and his son walk away together, the sense of injustice and humiliation slowly fading away with every step they took. As they stood outside, waiting for Elijah's father to speak, Elijah felt a mixture of emotions that he couldn't quite sort through. Relief and gratitude, and perhaps for the first time, a flicker of hope. He had never imagined that this moment, this small act of intervention, would make such a difference in his life. "I'm proud of you, Elijah," his father said finally, his voice softer now. "You did the right thing. You didn't let him get to you, and you kept your cool. That takes strength." Elijah smiled faintly. For the first time that morning, the tightness in his chest seemed to loosen, even if just a little. He knew this was only the beginning of a much larger conversation, about respect, about justice, and about the challenges he would face as a young black man in a world that often failed to see him for who he truly was. But with his father by his side, Elijah finally felt ready to face whatever came next. The ripple effect. The ride home was quiet, with only the soft hum of the car's engine breaking the silence between father and son. Elijah stared out the window, watching the world blur past them. Homes, shops, people walking, all seemingly unaware of what had just transpired. His father, Chief Marcus Johnson, sat beside him, focused on the road ahead. Neither spoke, but the air between them was charged with unspoken understanding. It was a rare moment, one in which Elijah could sense that his father's mind was far away, processing everything that had just happened on the bus. It wasn't until they reached their driveway that his father finally broke the silence. "Elijah," he began, his voice calm but firm, "what happened today wasn't right. And I know it's not the first time you've had to deal with something like this." Elijah remained quiet, his eyes still focused on the outside world. He wasn't sure how to respond. How could he explain to his father what it felt like to be constantly judged, to be treated as if he didn't belong? He had always known that his father's job came with a certain level of power and respect, but he had never fully understood how deep the implications of that power ran until now. "I know you faced things in school and out there that don't make sense, but you need to understand," his father continued, "that we're not powerless. We don't have to accept it, and you don't have to let people like him control how you feel about yourself." The words hit Elijah hard. He had always been taught to rise above the hate, to ignore the whispers and the stares, but hearing his father say that there was more he could do, that there was a way to fight back, stirred something inside of him. For so long, Elijah had tried to keep his head down, to blend in, to avoid conflict. But now, the idea of standing up, not just for himself, but for others who couldn't do it for themselves, seemed like something worth considering. The next few days at school were a blur. The incident on the bus became the talk of the school, but not for the reasons Elijah had hoped. Instead of his classmates rallying around him, offering words of encouragement or even sympathy, there was an uncomfortable distance. Whispers followed him down the hallways, and when he entered the cafeteria, he could feel the eyes of the students on his back. Some of the kids were staring at him like they had never seen him before, while others seemed to look away, as if they were ashamed to have witnessed the scene. But what hurt the most wasn't the whispers or the stares, it was the silence, the absence of any real support from his peers. Elijah had always been taught that standing up for what was right was important, but now, in the face of real consequences, it seemed like nobody else was willing to take a stand with him. By the time Elijah arrived home that afternoon, the weight of the day had become unbearable. He found his father in his office, the door ajar as always, with a stack of paperwork on his desk. His father's position as police chief often meant long hours and late nights, but today, Elijah found himself desperate for a conversation, a moment where he could make sense of everything swirling in his mind. "Dad?" Elijah called softly, his voice hesitant. "Hey, son," Chief Johnson responded, looking up from his desk. "How was school today?" Elijah took a deep breath before entering the room, pulling up a chair across from his father's desk. It was weird. Everyone's talking about the bus incident, but it's not the way I thought it would be. I thought people would back me up, but instead, they're just whispering behind my back. It's like they don't know how to handle what happened." Chief Johnson listened intently, his expression softening as he leaned back in his chair. "I understand. It's hard when the support you expect isn't there. Sometimes people are afraid to take sides, especially when they don't fully understand what's at stake. They don't know how to react to injustice, and it's easier for them to remain silent than to speak out." Elijah frowned. "But why? Why is it so hard for people to do the right thing?" "Because not everyone is as brave as you are, Elijah," his father said, his voice gentle but filled with wisdom. "Sometimes standing up for what's right means risking your own comfort, your own reputation. Not everyone is willing to do that. But you're different. You've always been different." Elijah's heart swelled with pride, but it was tempered by frustration. I don't know if I want to be different anymore, Dad. I don't know if I want to keep dealing with this stuff. I just want to be left alone." Chief Johnson leaned forward, his eyes locking with Elijah's. "Son, I get it. I've been there too. But the truth is, you can't change the world if you're not willing to face the things that scare you. You have a voice, and it matters. Your voice can change everything, even if it feels like it's not making a difference right now." Elijah's mind was racing, trying to digest everything his father was saying. Could he really make a difference? Could he really stand up for what was right, even when it seemed like nobody else would? The idea of being the one to challenge the status quo terrified him, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the only option. The next day, things took an unexpected turn. As Elijah was getting off the bus at the end of the school day, he noticed something strange. A small group of students was waiting by the bus doors, their eyes focused on him. Among them were a few of the kids he had known for years, some of whom had been whispering behind his back just days before. But now, there was something different in their eyes. There was no judgment, no fear. There was only resolve. Elijah, one of them, Marcus, called out to him, "We need to talk." Elijah stopped in his tracks, confused but intrigued. "About what?" "We've been talking," Marcus said, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "We saw what happened on the bus, and we realized we were wrong. We didn't stand up for you, and we should have. We want to help." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. These kids weren't just offering empty words, they were offering action. They wanted to make a change, to be part of something bigger than themselves. "We want to do more than just talk," Marcus continued. "We're planning to meet with the principal and the school board, and we want you to be part of it. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again to anyone else. Not just you, everyone." Elijah stood there, stunned. He had never expected this. He had always felt like the fight was his alone, that no one else would understand what he was going through. But now, it seemed like things were starting to change. The ripple effect of his father's intervention was beginning to spread, first to his friends, and now to the larger community. "Yeah," Elijah said, his voice filled with newfound determination. "I'll do it. I'll help." And just like that, Elijah's life began to change. He wasn't alone anymore. The power of unity. The days following the conversation with Marcus and the others were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and endless preparations. Elijah couldn't help but marvel at how quickly everything had escalated. One moment, he had been the victim of a cruel and isolated attack, and now he was standing on the precipice of something much larger, something that could potentially change not just his life, but the lives of others like him. The students who had approached him after school weren't just talking about change. They were taking action. The group had grown in size, and soon they were meeting every day after school in a small corner of the library, drafting letters, organizing petitions, and preparing to meet with the school principal and the Board of Education. They were determined to ensure that no student, regardless of race, background, or identity, would be subjected to the same treatment Elijah had experienced on the bus. At the heart of it all was Elijah, who had reluctantly become the face of their movement. He was the one who had been targeted, the one who had been humiliated, but now he was also the one who could bring about the change they so desperately needed. It was a responsibility Elijah hadn't asked for, but one he could no longer ignore. As the days passed, he felt the weight of that responsibility bearing down on him. Every conversation, every letter, every step forward felt like a challenge, one that required him to dig deep and confront his own fears. He had always been taught to keep his head down, to endure, but now he realized that endurance alone wouldn't bring about the change he wanted to see. The group, which had initially consisted of just a few brave souls, now included a diverse range of students, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, and more. It was clear that this wasn't just about Elijah anymore. It was about all of them. It was about standing together against the oppressive forces that had allowed injustice to thrive for so long. And that sense of unity was powerful. Elijah had always believed in the power of community, but he had never experienced it in such a profound way before. Every meeting, every conversation, and every gesture of support made him feel less alone in the world. His classmates, who had once looked at him with indifference, were now his allies. They were standing with him, speaking up, and demanding change. But the road ahead was far from easy. The day of the meeting with the principal and the school board arrived, and the weight of what was about to happen hung heavy in the air. Elijah could feel the nerves in his stomach as he stood in front of the school, waiting for the others to arrive. His father had insisted on accompanying him, despite Elijah's protests. Chief Johnson had always been there for him, but this was Elijah's fight now, or so he thought. "Elijah," his father said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder, "this is important. You're not alone. You have the support of your community, and I'm proud of you for standing up." Elijah looked up at his father, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had always known that his father was a source of strength, but it was moments like these that truly showed him the depth of that strength. His father wasn't just a police chief. He was a father who understood the challenges Elijah faced and was willing to help him navigate them. As they walked into the building, Elijah was surprised to see that the group of students was already assembled in the hallway, their faces filled with determination. Marcus, the leader of the student group, gave him a nod of encouragement as Elijah joined them. The others were all there, some familiar faces, some new, but each one shared the same goal: justice. "Everyone ready?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. There was a chorus of affirmations as the group stood tall, unified. Elijah couldn't help but feel a sense of pride wash over him. They weren't just fighting for him. They were fighting for every student who had ever felt marginalized, every student who had ever been made to feel small. The doors to the principal's office opened, and they were ushered in, one by one. The school board was already seated, their stern faces looking down at the group with what seemed to be mild curiosity. Elijah felt a twinge of unease, but he quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't about them. It was about the students and the message they were about to send. The meeting began with the usual formalities. The principal speaking, the board members nodding, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the group of students who stood before them. Elijah could tell they were trying to maintain their composure, but the tension in the room was palpable. Marcus stood up first, his voice clear and confident. "We're here today because of an incident that took place on the bus. One of our classmates, Elijah Johnson, was humiliated by a bus driver who singled him out because of his race. And that's not okay. Not now. Not ever. We want to ensure that no student here is ever made to feel inferior because of who they are." Elijah could feel the heat rising in his chest as Marcus spoke. His words were powerful, resonating deep within him. The anger that had built up over the past few days was starting to give way to something more meaningful, a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about creating a school environment where every student could feel safe, respected, and valued. Next, another student named Anna, who had been particularly vocal in the group, stood up. "We're not asking for much. We're asking for change. We're asking for accountability. We're asking for every student in this school to feel like they matter. It's time we create a school culture that values diversity and inclusion, a place where racism is not tolerated and where students of all backgrounds can thrive." Her words sent a ripple through the room, and for the first time that day, Elijah saw a flicker of something in the eyes of the school board members, something that resembled understanding. They were listening. One by one, other students shared their thoughts, their stories, and their hopes for a better future. Each speech built upon the last, each one reinforcing the idea that change was not only necessary, but possible. The board members remained quiet, but their expressions softened, and it became clear that the students' voices were being heard. Finally, it was Elijah's turn. He stood up slowly, his legs trembling, but his voice steady as he spoke. "I've spent my whole life trying to blend in, trying not to make waves. But today, I'm standing here because I don't want to stay silent anymore. I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through on that bus. We can't keep pretending like racism doesn't exist. We have to speak out. We have to make sure that no one else is ever made to feel the way I did. We have to be better than this." The room fell silent as Elijah's words lingered in the air. He had spoken from his heart, and he could tell that his message had resonated. The school board members exchanged glances, and one of them, a woman who had been quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke. "We hear you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And we're committed to making changes. We'll work with the student body to implement new policies, provide more education on diversity and inclusion, and ensure that this kind of behavior is never tolerated again." Elijah felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't over yet, but it was a start, a powerful start. The fight wasn't just his anymore. It was theirs, and together, they were going to make a difference. As they left the meeting, the group of students erupted into applause, their faces filled with joy and pride. Elijah stood among them, no longer feeling alone. This was the power of unity. This was what it felt like to stand together, to fight for what was right. And Elijah knew, without a doubt, that this was just the beginning. The struggle for justice. The days after the meeting with the school board were a whirlwind of activity. Word of the students' bold stand had spread throughout the school, and the atmosphere was charged with energy. The tension from the earlier days of whispers and uncertainty had transformed into a collective resolve. It wasn't just about Elijah anymore. It was about every student who had ever felt silenced or marginalized. The school was on the brink of change, but Elijah knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice wasn't going to be easy, and it certainly wasn't going to be over after one meeting. Elijah found himself more focused than ever. The support he had received from his peers had given him a renewed sense of purpose, but it also made him realize the enormity of the task ahead. He wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for every student who had ever faced discrimination, who had ever felt less than because of the color of their skin or their background. The school had promised to take action, but Elijah knew that promises were only as good as the follow-through. Over the next few weeks, the school board began implementing changes, slowly at first. They started with mandatory workshops on diversity and inclusion for both students and staff, and an open forum where students could voice their concerns and experiences. For Elijah, these changes felt like a small victory, but there was still more work to be done. The workshops were important, but they were only the beginning of what needed to be a complete overhaul of the culture within the school. One afternoon, after the bell rang and most of the students had filed out of the building, Elijah and a few of his friends stayed behind. They had decided to meet with the school principal, Mrs. Lawson, to discuss further steps in creating a more inclusive environment. They weren't content to just be passive participants in the change. They wanted to be the ones driving it forward. They had learned how to speak up, and now they were determined to make sure their voices were heard. As they sat in the principal's office, Elijah could feel the weight of the conversation that was about to take place. Mrs. Lawson sat behind her desk, looking both tired and resolute. She had always been a kind principal, but Elijah knew that the pressure was mounting on her to deliver on the promises the school had made. The district was watching, and it seemed like every decision had to be scrutinized. "Thank you for staying after school to meet with me," Mrs. Lawson said, offering a weary smile. "I know you all have been working hard to make sure the voices of students are heard, and I appreciate that. But now, it's time to start talking about real solutions." Elijah nodded, the sense of urgency rising in him. "We want to see real change," he said, his voice firm. "The workshops are good, but they're just the first step. We need to make sure that the curriculum includes more diverse perspectives. We need to make sure that every student, no matter their race or background, feels like they belong here." "I agree," Mrs. Lawson said. "But changing the culture of a school doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, and it takes effort from everyone. Teachers, students, administrators. We can't do this alone. Then we'll help, Marcus, one of the students leading the movement, said. We'll keep pushing for more change. We'll hold the school accountable. The principal smiled at Marcus' enthusiasm, but seemed slightly apprehensive. I appreciate your determination, but I want to make sure that we're being realistic here. There's a process. We have to work within the boundaries of the district's policies. There are some things that can't be changed right away. Elijah could sense the hesitation in Mrs. Lawson's voice, but he refused to back down. We understand that, but we need to see the changes happening. Not just promises. We need action. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with each of the students contributing their thoughts and ideas. They discussed everything from changing the way certain history lessons were taught to creating a peer mentoring program, where older students could help guide younger students in overcoming racism and discrimination. They talked about the need for more training for staff on how to address microaggressions and implicit bias. Each idea was met with varying degrees of resistance, but there was no denying the passion that the students brought to the table. They were not going to settle for anything less than real, tangible change. As the meeting concluded, Mrs. Lawson agreed to take their suggestions to the school district and promised to work with them on implementing new programs. But Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that, while progress had been made, there was still so much more to do. He knew that the real work was only just beginning. Over the next few weeks, the school continued to make strides in its efforts to create a more inclusive environment. Some students began to feel more comfortable speaking out, sharing their own experiences of discrimination and bias. Others were starting to understand the importance of standing up for one another, no matter their race or background. There were still challenges, still moments of hesitation, but the change was undeniable. Elijah, however, was beginning to feel the strain. The emotional toll of constantly fighting for justice was starting to wear on him. The weight of his role in this movement was heavy, and sometimes it felt like it was too much for him to carry on his own. There were nights when he lay awake, questioning whether it was all worth it. Was he really making a difference, or was he just spinning his wheels? One evening, after a particularly draining meeting with the school's diversity committee, Elijah sat on his bed, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed beside him, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from his father. I'm proud of you, son. Keep fighting for what's right. You're making a difference, whether you see it right now or not. But remember, change takes time. Stay strong. Elijah's heart swelled with pride at his father's words. It wasn't easy, and sometimes it felt like they weren't making enough of an impact, but his father was right. They were making a difference, no matter how small it seemed. The ripples of their efforts were starting to reach further than Elijah had imagined. It wasn't just about changing one school. It was about creating a culture of accountability, respect, and empathy that could extend far beyond the classroom. The next day, as Elijah walked into school, he noticed something different. There was a sense of optimism in the air that hadn't been there before. His classmates, many of whom had been hesitant to join the fight for change, were now actively participating in the discussions, attending the workshops, and taking pride in the progress they had made. It was clear that Elijah's efforts had inspired something greater than he could have ever imagined. The school was changing, and so were its students. Elijah stood tall as he entered the building, his steps more confident than they had been in a long time. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every student who had ever felt like they didn't belong. And with each step he took, he knew that he was making the world a little bit better, one conversation at a time. A legacy of change. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the school as Elijah made his way across the campus. It had been a few months since the initial meeting with the school board, and although progress was slow, there was no mistaking that things were changing. The atmosphere at the school felt different, lighter, more inclusive. The students who had once been indifferent to the struggles of their peers were now actively engaged in conversations about racism, equity, and the importance of community. Elijah was starting to see the fruits of his labor, but he knew that the battle was far from over. The change they had fought for was just the beginning. He had never imagined that his actions, which had started as a response to personal injustice, would snowball into something that could inspire a movement. But now, standing amidst the students and teachers who had rallied behind him, he realized that real change had to come from the ground up. And it started with people who were willing to stand up, even when it was hard. Walking into his history class that morning, Elijah felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had just come from a meeting with the school district, where he and his peers had discussed further initiatives to combat systemic discrimination. The district had agreed to introduce a mentorship program for minority students, offer more diverse reading materials, and create a dedicated student council position focused solely on fostering inclusion. The most exciting part, however, was the establishment of a student-led task force, which Elijah had been selected to lead. It felt surreal. He had gone from being the student who wanted nothing more than to be left alone to becoming a leader of the very change he had once only dreamed about. But as he sat down at his desk, the weight of everything that had transpired settled heavily on his shoulders. Elijah's friends and allies, many of whom were also part of the task force, had started to look to him for guidance, for direction. They respected him, yes, but it was clear that Elijah was still learning how to balance the role of being a leader while remaining true to himself. The responsibility was overwhelming at times, but he had never been more determined to make a lasting impact. "Hey, Elijah, you doing all right?" Marcus, his closest friend and fellow advocate, asked as he sat beside him, looking at him with concern. Elijah smiled faintly, pushing aside the swirl of thoughts in his head. "Yeah, just thinking about all the work left to do. It's a lot, you know." Marcus nodded, his face serious. "I get it, but you've already done so much. We all have. Look at the changes around here. You're helping create a place where students don't have to feel like they're invisible." Elijah glanced around the classroom. His classmates, some of whom had once mocked or ignored him, were now engaged in discussions about their school's history and the impact of diversity in education. He could see the difference in how they treated one another. Respect, curiosity, empathy. It was a far cry from the environment he had entered when he first arrived at the school. And it wasn't just the students who had shifted. The teachers were now actively incorporating lessons on cultural competency into their curriculums, ensuring that the changes Elijah and his peers had fought for didn't end at the door of the principal's office. A few weeks later, the first student-led task force meeting took place, and Elijah stood at the front of the room, feeling the weight of leadership in every inch of his body. There was a mixture of nervousness and excitement, but when he began speaking, the anxiety dissipated. He had spent so much time advocating for the changes he wanted to see, and now he had the power to lead the efforts. But it wasn't about him. It was about everyone in that room. Everyone who had fought for justice, for equality, and for the right to feel seen. "We've made a lot of progress," Elijah said, his voice steady, "but we can't stop here. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen because of one person. It happens because we work together. We push for the future we want to see, not just for ourselves, but for those who will come after us." He looked around the room at the diverse group of students who had gathered. Black, Latino, Asian, white, all united in their mission. Their faces were filled with determination and resolve. These were the students who would carry the torch of progress forward. We need to keep pushing for more diverse voices in our curriculum, for better representation in our extracurricular activities, and for policies that support all students, regardless of their background. Elijah continued, "We need to make sure that this school, this community, is one where everyone feels like they belong." After the meeting, as Elijah walked back to his locker, he was greeted by a few more students who wanted to thank him for everything he had done. They spoke of how his actions had inspired them to stand up for what was right, to speak out against injustice when they saw it. These were the same students who, just months ago, had stayed silent, afraid to rock the boat. Now, They were the ones making waves. As Elijah reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point, he realized just how far he had come. The shy, uncertain boy who had boarded that bus on the first day of school was now a leader, someone whose voice carried weight, whose actions had sparked a movement that was changing the culture of his school. But more than that, he had learned that leadership wasn't about power or recognition. It was about inspiring others to rise alongside you, to join the fight for justice, and to create a better world for everyone. But Elijah knew that this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The work they were doing at the school was only a small part of the larger fight against systemic racism and injustice that stretched far beyond the walls of their school. There was still much to be done, and Elijah was ready to continue that fight. The task force would keep pushing forward, advocating for policies and programs that promoted equality and fairness for all students, no matter where they came from. At home that night, Elijah sat down with his father to talk about everything that had happened. Chief Johnson listened intently, his face proud but thoughtful. He had always been a pillar of strength for Elijah, but now he saw his son as a peer, someone who was carrying the mantle of justice with the same integrity and courage that had defined his own career. "You've come a long way, son," Chief Johnson said, his voice full of pride. "I'm proud of you, not just for the changes you've made at your school, but for the way you've led with conviction and heart. You've shown people that real change starts with each of us, and I have no doubt that this is only the beginning for you." Elijah smiled, his chest swelling with pride. But he knew that the journey wasn't over. It was just the start of something much bigger. He was part of a movement that was reshaping the future, a movement that wasn't just about one school or one community. It was about changing the world, one step at a time. And as he lay in bed that night, Elijah realized that he wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was creating a legacy of change, one that would inspire future generations to rise up, speak out, and build a world where everyone truly belonged.